No handle, no escape, only questions. Welcome to Clue Law. I am your host, Vale. Share where you're listening from below. Thank you for being part of this. Straight into the mystery. It was upon a raw evening in late November, one of those London nights when the fog seems less a weather than a disposition of the city, that I first heard mention of the door with no handle. The year, I may say, was one in which my own professional engagements at St. Bartholomew's Hospital had of late pressed heavily upon me, and though I had done my best to maintain the habits of exercise and moderation which a military surgeon learns to prize, there were times when I found my thoughts wandering back to the less wholesome excitements of my Afghan service. It is an odd confession, perhaps, but true. The civilian life, in its regularity, possesses a kind of narcotic quality, and it was precisely this dullness, this respectable monotony, which had driven me, more than once, to seek the invigorating company of my former friend and companion, Mr. Sherlock Holmes. I had not seen Holmes for several days. His moods, as my readers will recall, were subject to those curious alternations which made him at one moment the most brilliant and vivacious of men, and at another a figure of sombre abstraction, silent, pale, and motionless, as though his very soul had withdrawn into some inner chamber where it laboured upon problems inaccessible to ordinary mortals. On the evening in question, I found myself turning, almost without conscious intention, into Baker Street. The gas lamps made small halos in the drifting mist, cab wheels hissed over the damp stones, and the passing forms of men and women appeared and vanished like phantoms, with only the faint clatter of their boots and the occasional flare of a cigar end to prove their material reality. Mrs. Hudson admitted me with her usual mixture of pride and solicitude. "Mr. Holmes is in, sir," said she, lowering her voice as though we were in a sick room. "But I should not say he is in an easy way this evening." That remark from Mrs. Hudson was as good as a medical bulletin. I mounted the familiar stairs and entered the sitting room which had been for so long the theatre of Holmes's singular gifts. The place was as I had left it, and yet wholly different, for it always took its character from the man himself. The chemical apparatus upon the side table was untouched. The violin lay unstrung upon the sofa, and the Persian slipper, which ordinarily held Holmes's tobacco, stood empty on the mantel, as if even that small indulgence had been set aside. Holmes was stretched at full length upon the couch, his long, thin hands clasped behind his head, his eyes fixed upon the ceiling. The lamplight picked out the sharp line of cheekbone and the ascetic curve of his jaw. At his feet, curled like some black gargoyle, lay the mongrel which he had recently taken an interest in, an ugly creature with intelligent eyes, of which Holmes had once observed that "a dog, Watson, will tell you more about a man than a man will tell you about himself." He did not move at my entrance, but I had scarcely closed the door behind me when his voice came, calm and accurate, out of the stillness. "You have been in the operating theatre today." I could not repress a smile. "And how, pray?" "The faint odour of carbolic upon your cuffs, for one thing, but also the manner in which you loosen your collar the moment you step into a warm room, an action which men perform after hours in a stifling atmosphere. Moreover, your left sleeve bears a minute smear of dried blood, arterial rather than venous, if I may be precise. You have been assisting in an amputation." "You are as unerring as ever," said I, taking the armchair opposite him. "It was a railway accident. A guard. Poor fellow, there was no choice." Holmes's eyes turned upon me at last, bright with that cold, amused light which never failed to make me feel that I stood before some instrument of reason rather than a man of flesh and impulse. "No choice," said he softly. "There is nearly always a choice. The difficulty is that most people cannot see it until long after the moment has passed." It was one of his philosophical sentences, flung out carelessly, as if he had not the leisure to consider whether it were profound. I was about to ask him what had so clearly placed him in one of his darker moods when a sharp knock sounded upon the door. Before I could rise, Mrs. Hudson's step hurried along the passage, and her hand fluttered at the handle. "There is a gentleman below, Mr. Holmes," she called. "He says it is most urgent. He will not give his name." Holmes sat up with sudden animation. Nothing, in truth, could so quickly sweep away the languor of his depression as the suggestion of a new problem. He sprang to his feet with the lithe grace of a fencer. "Show him up." In another moment, the visitor was ushered in, and the first impression which he made upon me was one of disorder, of something in him which did not match itself. He was a man, I should judge, of perhaps 45 or 50, spare and tall, with a well-cut black frock-coat and the appearance of one who had once been punctilious in his dress. Yet his cravat was badly tied, his hat was damp and crushed as though it had been gripped too tightly, and his gloves, one of them torn at the finger, were shoved into a pocket with the heedlessness of a person whose mind was wholly elsewhere. His face was the face of an educated Englishman, clean-shaven, with a narrow moustache and grey eyes set rather close. But there were two things about it which were instantly remarkable. The first was a peculiar pallor, as if the blood had retreated from the skin. The second was the expression of control, not calm, but restraint, such restraint as a man exhibits when fear is within him and he is determined that it shall not show. He stood for a second within the room, blinking as if the lamplight pained him, and then his gaze fell upon Holmes with something between relief and desperation. "Mr. Sherlock Holmes?" Holmes inclined his head slightly. "At your service. This is my friend and colleague, Dr. Watson." The man gave me a glance so brief that it might almost have been accidental. Then he stepped forward, lowered his voice, and spoke with an urgency which made my skin prickle. "I must ask you, Mr. Holmes, before I say anything else, to give me your word that what I tell you will not be repeated beyond this room, save where it is necessary to save a life." Holmes's eyebrows rose. "You ask a great deal." "I ask what I must," said the stranger, his hands tightening upon the brim of his hat until I saw the leather flecks. "If you refuse, then I have come to the wrong man, and I shall go." Holmes's eyes, those keen grey eyes which seemed to look through the skin and bone of a man into the secret motives beneath, rested upon him for an instant. Then he waved his hand toward the chair. "Sit down. You have my word, so far as any gentleman's word may satisfy you." The man seated himself upon the edge of the chair as though he feared to relax. For a moment he seemed unable to begin, and when at last he did speak, it was with an effort, as if he were forcing his thoughts into order. "My name," said he, "is Mr. Lionel Darvell." Holmes's expression did not change, but I observed that his attention sharpened. He had that look of a man who hears a name and instantly places it within some hidden catalogue of memory. "I am," continued our visitor, "in the employ of Sir Julian Deverell of Montague Square." "Ah," said Holmes, very softly, so softly that it was scarcely more than a breath. Mr. Darvell started, for Holmes's little interjection seemed to him a sign that he had already been judged or understood. "You know him?" "I know of him," said Holmes. "Proceed." Mr. Darvell licked his lips. "Sir Julian has enemies. That is not surprising. He has money, he has influence, and he has, if I may say so, certain habits which are not calculated to make him beloved." Holmes's mouth twitched. "A delicate phrase." "It is the truth," Darvell insisted. "Yet what has happened is beyond mere dislike. It is—" His voice faltered, and he glanced toward the window where the fog pressed against the panes like a living thing. "It is as if someone has taken hold of the very structure of his house and of his life, and begun, quietly, to rearrange it." Holmes leaned forward, his elbows upon his knees, his long fingers steepled. "You will be more exact, Mr. Darvell, if you please." Darvell drew a deep breath. "In Sir Julian's house," said he, "there is a door." Holmes nodded as though the matter were perfectly natural. "There are commonly several. This one," said Darvell. "Has no handle." For the first time I saw Holmes's eyes flash with interest. He did not speak, but his stillness invited the man to continue. "It is on the second floor," Darvell went on. "At the end of the east passage. It has been there, as far as I know, since the house was built. It is an oak door, painted white, with a frame that matches the paneling, but there is no knob, no latch, no keyhole. Nothing. It is a door in name only." "A sham door," said Holmes quietly. "No," Darvell answered, and his voice broke upon the word. "That is what I believed. That is what we all believed. Sir Julian joked about it, called it the door to nowhere. The maids dusted it, the footman walked past it, and no one thought twice." Holmes's gaze never left the man's face. "And now you do." Darvell's hands trembled. He clenched them together as if to crush the shaking. "3 weeks ago," said he, "Sir Julian's valet, Harris, disappeared." "Disappeared," I repeated involuntarily. Darvell's eyes darted to me, and the restraint which he had maintained gave way to sudden, raw fear. "He went to bed," said he. "He was in his room at 11. At 6 in the morning his bed had been slept in, his boots were on the mat, his clothes were folded. But Harris was gone. The window was bolted from within. The door was locked. There is no second exit." Holmes's voice was very calm. "Locked by whom?" "By Harris himself," Darvell answered. "He had the key, as is customary. It was found in the lock on the inside. The maid could not enter. I forced the door. The key snapped. That is how we discovered he was absent." Holmes's fingers moved slightly as though he were playing an invisible violin. "Continue." "At first," Darvell said, "we supposed him ill. Gone out in the night, perhaps, and fallen in the street. We notified the police. Inspector Lestrade himself came. Sir Julian has dealings with Scotland Yard, as you may imagine." Holmes gave a brief nod, but offered no comment. "They searched," Darvell continued. "They found nothing, no footprints outside the window, no marks upon the sill. The servants were questioned, and Sir Julian—" He paused, swallowing. "Sir Julian was furious. He accused us all of negligence, of conspiracy, of theft. Then, 2 nights later, another man vanished." Holmes's head lifted. "Who?" "Mr. Larkin," said Darvell. "A footman, a young fellow. He had been with us only 6 months. He slept in the servants' quarters at the back of the house. The circumstances were not the same. His door was not locked, for those quarters have only simple latches. But he was seen at midnight, and at 5 he was missing. His boots remained. His wages were untouched. He simply ceased to be present." "And the door with no handle," said Holmes. Darvell's eyes fixed upon Holmes with an intensity that bordered upon accusation. "After the second disappearance," said he, "Sir Julian ordered the house searched from roof to cellar. He was convinced that someone was hiding in it, that some secret chamber existed which he had overlooked. We tapped walls, lifted carpets, examined cupboards. It was then that one of the maids, Sarah Collins, said something foolish. She said that perhaps the men had gone through the door at the end of the east passage." Holmes's lips parted in the ghost of a smile. "And Sir Julian, I presume, did not laugh." "He did not," said Darvell hoarsely. "For when we went to that door, it was different." "In what way?" "There was a mark upon it," Darvell whispered. "Not a mark of damage, a mark as if something had been handled. A faint smudge, Mr. Holmes. Like the print of a palm upon paint." Holmes's eyes gleamed. "And yet there is no handle." "There is none," Darvell insisted. "No bolt, no latch, nothing to take hold of, and yet something had touched it." Holmes stood and paced once across the room. I could read in his movements that quickening which meant his mind had seized upon a track. "What did you do?" he asked. "Sir Julian commanded me to open it," Darvell said. "As if I could. We tried prying it. We examined the frame. There was no give, no seam beyond that of any ordinary door. We even knocked away a portion of the skirting to see if there were a hidden bolt. Nothing. Holmes stopped before the fireplace and looked down at Darvell as if the man were a specimen under a lens. "And the third week?" said he. Darvell's throat worked. "That is why I'm here." Holmes's voice fell an octave. "Something happened to Sir Julian." Darvell's eyes widened. "How?" Holmes waved the question aside impatiently. "Tell me." "This morning," Darvell said, "Sir Julian's secretary, Miss Violet Harrow, came to the house as usual at 9. She found Sir Julian in his study, lying upon the rug. He was alive, but he could not speak. His face was—" Darvell's composure snapped for a moment, and his hands came up as if to shield his eyes from memory. "His face was twisted, Mr. Holmes, not with pain alone, with terror." "A stroke?" I suggested. "Not a stroke," Darvell answered. Dr. Penrose, Sir Julian's physician, was called at once. He examined him. Sir Julian's limbs responded. His pupils were normal. There was no paralysis, no sign of apoplexy, but he could not speak. He could only make a sound, like a man trying to scream through a gag. And Darvell's voice lowered to a whisper, and the door with no handle was standing open. A silence fell over the room, so complete that I could hear the tick of the little clock upon the mantel and the faint rustle of the fog against the glass. Holmes did not move. He did not even blink. But I saw, in the tightening of his mouth, that the problem had gripped him as nothing in recent days had done. "The door was open," he repeated slowly, tasting the words. "And what lay beyond it?" Darvell gave a short, bitter laugh. "That," said he, "is the devil of it. There was nothing beyond. Only the wall." I stared. "The wall?" "Yes," Darvell insisted. "The door opened inward upon solid panelling. No cavity, no room. The same wall, the same wood. As if the door were hinged to a surface which had never been meant to admit any passage. And yet, Mr. Holmes, it swung open. I saw it with my own eyes. Miss Harrow saw it. Dr. Penrose saw it. And when we looked, there was a scrape upon the floor where the bottom edge had moved, and a fresh line in the dust along the hinge." Holmes's gaze flicked to me for a fraction of a second, a glance of pure intelligence, as if he wished to assure himself that I had comprehended the full impossibility of what had been said. "And Sir Julian," said he, "was found in his study. How far from this door?" "On the first floor," Darvell answered, "at the front of the house. A man could not fall from that passage to his study unless he flew." Holmes turned away and resumed his pacing. His hands clasped behind him now in that attitude of concentrated thought which I had observed so often. He was no longer languid. He was no longer depressed. He was alive, strangely alive, in the way that only a mind like his can be alive when confronted by a paradox. "And what," he asked suddenly, "was missing?" Darvell blinked, taken aback. "Missing, sir?" "Yes. In any disturbance, something is taken or something is left. What is missing from Sir Julian's study?" Darvell frowned, striving to recollect. "Nothing of value, sir. There was no sign of robbery. His desk drawers were locked. His papers were in order." Holmes halted, and his face took on that sharp, hawk-like look which always meant he had seen a small point which others had passed by. "His papers," said he. "In order. And yet you say he was found on the rug. Did he fall? Did he crawl? Was anything spilled?" "There was ink upon the blotter," Darvell said slowly, as if his pen had been dropped and his chair was pushed back. "And the fire?" asked Holmes. "Had it been tended?" "Yes," Darvell replied. "The fire was burning as usual." Holmes's eyes narrowed. "And the windows?" "They were closed," Darvell said. "Bolted." Holmes nodded once as though that single word had confirmed some private hypothesis. "Very good. Now tell me about Miss Harrow." Darvell looked startled. "Miss Harrow? Sir, she is merely the secretary." Holmes's mouth curved. "There are no merelys in a case, Mr. Darvell." "Describe her." "She is a young lady," Darvell said reluctantly. "Perhaps 25, educated, quiet, always punctual. She has been with Sir Julian a little over a year. She comes each day to take dictation and manage his correspondence." Holmes's fingers drummed softly upon the mantel. "From where does she come?" "From Bloomsbury," said Darvell. "She lodges there with an aunt, I believe." "And Dr. Penrose? How long has he attended Sir Julian?" "Many years," Darvell answered. "Since before my own employment." Holmes turned, and in that moment he seemed less a man than a blade, bright, narrow, and purposeful. "One more question," said he. "This door with no handle, why has it never been altered? Men with money do not keep architectural absurdities unless they have reason." Darvell hesitated. His eyes slid away. Holmes's voice became gentle, dangerously gentle. "You have not told me everything, Mr. Darvell." The man's shoulders sagged as if the words had struck him physically. "I have told you what I can," he said, very low. "There are matters. Sir Julian's family, the house, things which—" Holmes's hand cut the air. "Save your discretion for those who deserve it," said he sharply. "Your master lies struck dumb. 2 men have vanished within his walls, and a door which opens upon a wall has been found standing open as if it had been used. Either you tell me all that you know, or you may as well go back to Montague Square and wait for the 3rd disappearance, or the 4th. Darvell's face twitched. For an instant I thought he would rise and flee. Then, with a sudden decision, he thrust his torn glove deeper into his pocket and leaned forward. "There is a legend," said he, and his voice trembled in spite of himself. "It is not spoken of in the house, but every servant learns it sooner or later. They say that Sir Julian's grandfather, old Sir Percival, built that door after a scandal. There was a woman, a governess, who died in the house. Some say she threw herself down the stairs. Some say she was pushed. After her death, Sir Percival had workmen come by night. They panelled over something, a room perhaps, a passage. No one knows. But when the carpenters were done, there was that door, white-painted, neat as any other, and useless as a picture on a wall." Holmes's eyes never wavered. "A concealed room. Perhaps," Darvell whispered, "or perhaps only a symbol. But now, Mr. Holmes, if it is only a symbol, why does it open? And if it opens, what lies behind it that we cannot see?" Holmes stood quite still for several seconds. Then he crossed to the bell and rang for Mrs. Hudson. "We shall go to Montague Square at once," said he. Darvell exhaled, and I saw his rigid composure crumble into something like relief. "Thank God." Mrs. Hudson appeared in the doorway, her face anxious. "Lay out my ulster," said Holmes. "And my lantern. Watson, if you will take your coat. We may be out late." I rose, feeling that familiar quickening of the blood which always came upon me when Holmes's voice took that tone. The fog, the urgency, the impossible door, these were the very ingredients of those singular adventures which, in after years, I have found myself recording with equal parts amazement and gratitude. As Holmes turned to the table to select, with fastidious care, a handful of his instruments, his lens, his measuring tape, a small packet of sealing wax, my eyes fell upon the visitor's hat. It lay upon the chair beside him, brim upward, still beaded with moisture. In the lamplight I could see, clinging to the felt, a few pale grains of something fine as sand. Holmes's gaze followed mine, and for an instant the corner of his mouth lifted. "You observe, Watson," said he quietly, "and yet you do not deduce." I flushed. "It is merely dirt from the street." "Is it?" said Holmes, and with that he took up the hat delicately and held it to the light. Mr. Darvell half rose. "You must understand, Mr. Holmes, I came as quickly as I could." Holmes waved him down without looking at him. His eyes were upon the grains. "Not street mud," said he. "Not clay, not soot. A fine, pale grit. Chalk, perhaps, or powdered plaster. And here, he ran a finger along the inner band, a faint stain of linseed oil. You have been near fresh paint or varnish. A man does not acquire such things merely by walking through the fog. Darvell's face went ashen. Holmes set the hat down gently. "No," said he, almost to himself. "You have been at the door." The man opened his mouth, but no sound came. For a moment he sat, stricken, as if Holmes had torn away the last scrap of his secrecy. Holmes turned to him with sudden, brisk authority. "You went back to the house," said he. "You could not resist. You examined it again. You attempted something, and now you have come to me, not only because Sir Julian is incapacitated, but because you fear what you may have done." Darvell's hands shook violently now, and the proud restraint of him was gone. "I had to know," he whispered. "I had to know if there was a seam, if there was a catch. Anything. And when I only pressed upon the panel beside the hinge," Holmes's eyes narrowed. "Yes." Darvell swallowed hard. "It moved," said he. "Not the door, the wall, only a hair's breadth, but I felt it yield under my hand." Holmes's face was suddenly very intent. So intent that it seemed to draw the whole room into its focus. "Excellent," said he. Darvell stared. "Excellent." Holmes slipped on his coat, his movements quick and precise. "Excellent," he repeated. "Because it means, Mr. Darvell, that the impossible door is not impossible at all. It is merely ingenious." He turned to me, and in his eyes there was that familiar gleam of intellectual delight which I had learned to recognize as the true opiate of his strange nature. "Come, Watson," said he. "We have a door to open, and a man to silence." And with that, we descended into the fog-bound street, leaving behind the warm lamplight of Baker Street for the colder, darker uncertainties of Montague Square, where a white-painted door stood open upon a wall, and where, I could not help feeling, something unseen waited patiently for us to arrive. The cab which Holmes hailed came gliding out of the fog like some cautious creature, its lamps two dim eyes in the white. We were scarcely seated when he thrust his head forward through the trap and gave the driver a curt direction. "Montague Square, and drive as if you were paid to save a hanging man." The horse sprang into a quicker trot, the wheels clattering over the stones. Mr. Darvell sat opposite us, his hat clasped between his hands, his gaze fixed upon it as if he expected it to offer him counsel. He had the look of a man who has crossed some invisible boundary and cannot decide whether he has escaped danger or only entered a deeper one. Holmes, on the other hand, appeared in that alert serenity which with him signified intense activity. His eyes, half-lidded, watched the play of light and shadow across Darvell's face. More than once I saw his long fingers move softly against his knee, as though he were counting or setting into order some chain of reasoning which did not require speech. At length, unable to endure the silence, I addressed our companion. "You spoke of 2 disappearances," said I. "Has there been no trace? No letter, no demand for money?" "None," Darvell answered without lifting his eyes. "Harris had a sister in Lambeth. She came sobbing, saying he was a steady man. Mr. Larkin's mother wrote from Kent. There was no word. It is as if they were—" He broke off, and his fingers tightened upon the hat. "As if they had never been." Holmes's voice dropped into the conversation as neatly as a scalpel into flesh. "They were not men of fortune," said he. "There would be no ransom. If this is a crime, and it is, then the motive is either concealment, intimidation, or revenge." Darvell shuddered. "Revenge upon whom, Mr. Holmes?" "Upon Sir Julian." "Possibly," said Holmes. "Or upon someone sheltered by Sir Julian, or upon the house itself." "The house?" Darvell repeated, bewildered. Holmes did not answer directly. "Tell me, Mr. Darvell, when you pressed upon the panel beside the hinge, was it the same panel which bears the hand smudge you described?" Darvill's eyes flickered up for the first time. Yes. And you did this after Sir Julian was found? Darvill hesitated. After Dr. Penrose had left. Miss Harrow remained with Sir Julian. The servants were in disorder, some weeping, some whispering. I went upstairs. I told myself it was my duty. If there were a secret place, if those men were hidden, and yet you did not call the police again, said Holmes. Darvill's cheeks coloured faintly. Sir Julian had ordered Lestrade out of the house. He was in a rage, even before this happened. He said the yard would only spread gossip. He said he would handle it privately. Holmes nodded once, as though the point were precisely what he had expected. We shall see, said he. We had reached the square by then, a broad, respectable place, its iron railings wet with mist, its tall houses looming like dark cliffs. The Deverell residence stood among them with an air of severe prosperity. Its windows were dark, save for a single glow upon the first floor. The cab had barely stopped when Holmes was out upon the pavement. He paused for a second. His head turned slightly, like a man listening. Then he moved, swiftly and without hesitation, up the steps and rang the bell. The door was opened almost at once by a butler whose face bore that strained neutrality which well-trained servants assume in moments of household crisis. His eyes darted from Holmes to Darvill, and I saw recognition and uneasiness mingle. "Mr. Darvill," said he. "This is Mr. Sherlock Holmes," Darvill returned. "He is here at my request. Sir Julian requires assistance." The butler stiffened. "Sir Julian is alive," said Darvill sharply, "and incapable of speech. You may announce us, George." The man's nostrils flared. I could see that the name of Holmes had struck him, as it strikes many in London, with a certain awe and a certain fear. He stood aside, and we entered. The hall was warm, smelling faintly of coal smoke and beeswax, and yet it had the oppressive air of a place where something wrong has occurred. A footman lingered near the umbrella stand, twisting his hands. A maid passed quickly through an archway with red eyes and a tray she seemed not to see. Somewhere above, a door closed softly. Holmes shed his coat with mechanical ease and hung it upon the stand as if he were in Baker Street. His calmness, in such surroundings, had always struck me as the most extraordinary feature of his character. It was as though the agitation of others merely provided him with a clearer field. "Sir Julian is in his study," Darvill murmured. "Then we begin," said Holmes. "Watson, keep your senses about you. No one in a frightened house sees accurately." We were led through a corridor whose walls were lined with portraits, stern men in wigs and ladies in silks, until we reached a door from behind which came the low crackle of a fire and, faintly, the sound of a woman's voice speaking in a soothing monotone. Darvill knocked. The voice ceased. The door opened. Miss Violet Harrow stood before us, her hand upon the knob. She was, as Darvill had described, a young woman of quiet bearing, but there was a pallor upon her face and a stiff set to her mouth which told of a strain endured. Her hair was plainly arranged, her dress dark and modest, and yet there was an impression of intelligence in the steady gaze she turned upon Holmes. "Mr. Holmes," said she. Holmes inclined his head. "Miss Harrow, I presume. You sent for Dr. Penrose." "I did," she replied. "Sir Julian—" Her voice faltered for the first time. She swallowed and continued with effort. "Sir Julian is resting. If you have come to excite him, I have come to prevent his murder," said Holmes quietly. The bluntness of it made her draw back as if struck. For a second her composure wavered, and I saw fear, pure, startled fear, flash in her eyes. "Murder," she whispered. Holmes brushed past her into the room. The study was a handsome apartment, panelled in dark wood, with books in glass-fronted cases and heavy curtains drawn against the fog. A bright fire burned in the grate. Upon the rug before it lay a man. Sir Julian Deverell was a figure of middle height, broad-shouldered, with iron-grey hair, and a face which, even in repose, suggested imperious will. Yet now that face was slack in places and strained in others, as if the muscles could not decide whether to relax or hold. His eyes were open. They fixed upon Holmes with a look of desperate intelligence. He tried to speak, and from his throat came that dreadful muffled sound which Darvell had described, a noise that was less a cry than the ghost of one. I stepped forward at once, my medical instincts surging up. "Let me see him." Holmes held up a hand. "In a moment, Watson. Observe first." He moved around the prone figure with the swift, light step of a cat, his eyes taking in everything, the position of the limbs, the angle of the head, the scattered papers upon the desk, the chair thrust back at a diagonal. He knelt, not by Sir Julian, but by the edge of the rug where it met the polished floor. "Interesting," said he softly. Miss Harrow had closed the door behind us. She stood now with her hands clasped at her waist, watching. Darvell hovered near the fireplace, his face drawn. Holmes touched the carpet lightly with a finger, then brought it to his nose. "No blood," said he. "No bruise, no sign of impact. Yet he is on the floor. You said he was found thus at 9? Miss Harrow nodded. "I came as I always do. He was to dictate letters. I knocked. No answer. I entered. He was there." Her eyes flicked to Sir Julian's face and away again. "I thought him dead." "And yet the fire had been tended," Holmes murmured. "It is tended at 7, Darvell said quickly. "The footman does it." Holmes's gaze shot to him. "Which footman?" Darvell hesitated. "Peters. Bring Peters," said Holmes. Darvell moved toward the bell rope. But Holmes was already rising. "Now, Watson," said he, "examine him." I knelt beside Sir Julian. His skin was cool but not cold. His pulse was strong and regular. His breathing, though shallow, was steady. His pupils responded normally. There were no signs of paralysis. When I lifted an arm, it resisted, not in weakness, but in rigid tension. He tried to grasp my wrist, and his fingers closed with surprising strength. His eyes never left Holmes's face. "It is not apoplexy," I said, looking up. "Not in any usual form. He is conscious. He can move. He is—" I hesitated, for the truth was strange. "He is as if struck dumb by shock, or by some influence upon the throat." Holmes crouched beside me, his gaze upon Sir Julian's neck and jaw. "Hold his head, Watson." I did so, and Holmes's fingers, cool and precise, ran lightly along the side of the throat, beneath the ear, down to the collarbone. Sir Julian flinched, once, at a point just under the left angle of the jaw. Holmes's eyes sharpened. "There," said he quietly. He bent closer, and I saw him inspect the skin with a care so minute that it seemed absurd, until I noticed, where his finger had indicated, a tiny discoloration, no bigger than a pin's head, a faint bluish speck against the pale flesh. "A puncture," said Holmes. Miss Harrow made a sound like a caught breath. Darvell's face went white. "A puncture," I repeated. "From what? A needle?" Holmes did not answer at once. His gaze had shifted to the desk. He rose, crossed to it, and with a deft motion opened the top drawer. Miss Harrow started forward. "Sir, those are private—" Holmes's voice snapped like a whip. "Private things have a habit of becoming public when men begin to vanish within a house. Stand back." He rummaged for a moment among papers, then withdrew a small object held between finger and thumb. It was a slender tube of metal, no longer than a pencil, with a tiny aperture at one end. I stared. "What is it?" Holmes's eyes were cold. "A blowpipe," said he, "and if I am not mistaken, used recently." He held it to the light. In the aperture there was a smear, so faint that I might have missed it. Holmes touched it with the tip of a knife and then glanced at his finger. Something oily, said he. Something that would carry a drug. Miss Harrow swayed slightly, as if the room had shifted beneath her. Her lips parted, but no words came. Holmes turned on her with sudden intensity. "Who had access to this drawer?" he demanded. Miss Harrow's voice was a whisper. "Sir Julian, and sometimes me. I keep his correspondence." Holmes nodded once, as though he had expected the answer and yet found it newly suggestive. Sir Julian made a desperate sound and lifted a trembling hand, pointing not at Miss Harrow, nor at Darvell, nor at Holmes, but toward the door, as if the very wooden hinges held the key to his terror. Holmes followed the gesture, and his gaze became for an instant unreadable. "The door with no handle," said he softly. "Very well." He straightened, his whole manner suddenly brisk. "Watson, remain with Sir Julian. Do not leave him alone. Miss Harrow, you will stay here as well. Mr. Darvell, you will take me upstairs to the East Passage, and you will do so now, before any other pair of curious hands smudges what should be clean." He moved toward the study door, then paused, looking back at Sir Julian. "You have been very close to the truth, Sir Julian," said he, almost kindly. "Close enough that someone has tried to stop your mouth. I intend to give it back to you." Sir Julian's eyes burned with gratitude, or with something near to it. And then Holmes was gone, his footsteps already quickening down the hall, leaving me kneeling beside the stricken man, with the firelight flickering over his rigid face and the oppressive certainty settling upon my mind that, whatever lay behind that absurd white door, it had teeth. Left alone with Sir Julian, I settled myself beside him, my mind torn between professional concern and a growing unease which no reasoning could entirely dispel. Miss Harrow sat rigidly in a chair near the desk, her hands folded so tightly that the knuckles shone white. Neither of us spoke. Sir Julian's eyes followed the door through which Holmes had departed, and every so often that strangled sound escaped his throat, as if some inward pressure demanded release. I busied myself with small attentions, loosening his collar, easing his position, testing again the steadiness of his pulse. Yet all the while my thoughts ran ahead, following Holmes up the stairs, down the East Passage, toward that white door which had no business to exist, and yet insisted upon asserting itself. The minutes dragged. At length, faint but distinct, there came from above a sound, a dull, muffled thud, followed by a pause and then another, more deliberate. Miss Harrow started to her feet. "What is that?" she whispered. "Mr. Bartlett." "Holmes," I said, though I could not have told her how I knew. The sounds ceased. Silence pressed in again, broken only by the ticking of the clock and the low crackle of the fire. Sir Julian's eyes widened. His fingers dug into the rug. I leaned closer. "Be calm," I murmured. "He will not act rashly." Yet even as I spoke, I knew Holmes well enough to understand that if he had begun some experiment, it would be one of those daring, irrevocable kind which allow no interruption. It was perhaps 10 minutes later, though it felt longer, that footsteps came rapidly down the stairs. The study door was flung open, and Holmes entered with Darvell close behind him. Both men bore the marks of exertion. Darvell's face was flushed, his hair disordered. Holmes's eyes shone with a peculiar brightness, and there was upon his fingers a faint dusting of white. "Watson," said he at once, "how is our patient?" "Unchanged," I replied. "Conscious, distressed, but stable." "Good," said Holmes. He crossed to Sir Julian and bent close, speaking with deliberate emphasis. "You are safe for the moment. Do you understand me?" Sir Julian's eyelids fluttered. His hand moved, slightly but unmistakably, in assent. "Excellent," Holmes went on. "Now attend. Do not strain yourself. Merely listen." He straightened and turned to us. "The door," said he quietly, "is neither supernatural nor ornamental. It is functional. Ingeniously, devilishly so. And it is not a door at all in the ordinary sense. Darville gave a hoarse laugh. Then what is it, Mr. Holmes? A lever, Holmes answered. A lever disguised as a door. Miss Harrow stared. A lever to what? Holmes glanced at Sir Julian before replying. To a space which no architect would admit and no casual search would reveal. A space between walls. Darville's breath caught. A hiding place? More than that, said Holmes. A passage. Narrow, vertical, and very old. It runs behind the panelling of the east passage and connects by means of a sloping crawl to a cavity above the first-floor ceiling. To the study? I exclaimed. Holmes nodded. Directly above it. Miss Harrow sank back into her chair. But the door opens on a wall, she whispered. We saw it. You saw what you were meant to see, Holmes replied. The door does not open outward. It yields inward, slightly, and releases a concealed spring. What swings is not the door itself, but a false panel beyond it. The effect is theatrical and convincing. One sees an open door and solid wall and concludes impossibility. In truth, the opening lies behind the hinge line, concealed by the angle of sight. Darville passed a trembling hand across his forehead. Then the men, Harris and Larkin, they were taken up, said Holmes. Not out. The first man likely stumbled upon the mechanism by chance. The second, perhaps lured, perhaps silenced. Both were removed from the house without crossing a threshold. Miss Harrow's eyes flew to Sir Julian. But why? Why them? Holmes did not answer at once. Instead, he reached into his pocket and drew out a small object wrapped in his handkerchief. He laid it upon the desk and unfolded the cloth. It was a dart, tiny, no longer than a matchstick, with a fine needle point darkened at the tip. The instrument of Sir Julian's muteness, said Holmes. I found 2 more lodged in a crack above the study cornice. One spent, one unused. I felt a chill. Then whoever attacked him was above. Inside the wall? Yes, said Holmes, and familiar with the house. Familiar enough to know when Sir Julian would be alone and confident enough to strike silently. Darville's voice shook. Then the attacker, could still be here. Holmes's smile was thin. That possibility has not escaped me. Sir Julian uttered a sudden, urgent sound and beat his hand weakly against the rug. Holmes was instantly beside him. Yes, he said soothingly. You wish to warn us. You wish to tell us who it is. Sir Julian's eyes blazed. His hand groped clumsily, then fell upon the edge of the desk. His fingers scrabbled, caught, and dragged toward him a sheet of paper. With immense effort, he seized a pencil. I moved to steady his hand, but Holmes shook his head. Let him, said he. This matters. The pencil wavered, then touched the paper. Slowly, painfully, Sir Julian formed a mark. It was not a word, merely a shape, jagged and uneven. Holmes leaned closer. His face grew intent. A triangle, he murmured. No, a letter, an unfinished letter. Sir Julian gasped and pressed harder. The line extended, bent. Holmes inhaled sharply. A V, said he. Violet. Miss Harrow sprang up as if stung. That is madness, she cried. Sir Julian, you cannot mean... Holmes raised his hand. Silence. Sir Julian's eyes were fixed upon the young woman. There was no accusation in them, only desperate insistence. Miss Harrow's composure shattered. I did nothing, she said, her voice rising. I found him. I called the doctor. Holmes regarded her steadily. Indeed. And you had the key to his desk. You knew his habits. You knew when he would be alone. You had reason. Her face flushed, then drained. Reason? Holmes's voice was quiet, relentless. Your aunt in Bloomsbury, once a governess, employed years ago in this very house, dismissed in disgrace, dead within a month. The words fell like stones. Miss Harrow staggered back. her hand flying to her mouth. "You know nothing," she whispered. "I know enough," said Holmes. "The door was built to conceal scandal. The scandal was not ended by concealment. It bred resentment. Resentment passed down. You came into this house not as a servant, but as a strategist, patient, careful. You tested the passage. You removed the servants who might discover it. And when Sir Julian began to suspect, when he ordered searches, you silenced him." "That is a lie," she cried. Holmes turned abruptly. "Darvell, ring for the police." Darvell hesitated only a fraction of a second before obeying. Miss Harrow's eyes darted toward the door, then upward, as if measuring distance. "You cannot prove it," she said, her voice trembling with fury. "There is no body. No witness." Holmes smiled faintly. "On the contrary, there is a witness, a frightened one, but an eloquent one." He glanced at Sir Julian. "And there are the missing men," he added, "one of whom I believe is still alive." Miss Harrow froze. Holmes' eyes hardened. "The passage does not lead out," said he. "It leads down, to the old coal vault beneath the square, a place forgotten, airless, but not immediately fatal." Sir Julian made a choking sound that might have been triumph. Miss Harrow sank into a chair, her defiance collapsing into something like despair. As the sound of approaching boots echoed in the hall, Holmes drew a long breath and turned to me. "Watson," said he quietly, "this house has been living with its past sealed behind a wall. Tonight the wall has answered." And as I looked at Sir Julian's strained, grateful eyes, and at the broken figure of the woman who had tried to turn architecture into vengeance, I knew that the most dangerous doors are not those which will not open, but those which should never have been closed at all. The heavy tread in the passage resolved itself into brisk official steps, and Inspector Lestrade, hat in hand, collar turned up against the fog, entered the study with 2 constables at his back. His sharp, fox-like face took in the scene in a single glance. Sir Julian upon the rug, Miss Harrow pale and rigid in her chair, Darvell standing like a man who had rung a bell to summon judgment, and Holmes composed by the fire, as if awaiting guests for tea. "Well, Mr. Holmes," said Lestrade, with that mingled irritation and reluctant respect which he commonly displayed toward my friend, "I received an urgent message." "You received it quickly," Holmes returned. "That speaks well for Scotland Yard, and ill for this household's desire for privacy." Lestrade sniffed and stepped nearer to Sir Julian. "Sir Julian! Good Lord, what has happened to him?" "A dart," said Holmes, holding up his handkerchief-wrapped find. "A drug. A puncture under the jaw. Dr. Watson will tell you the condition is not apoplexy." Lestrade glanced at me, and I inclined my head. "Not a stroke," said I. "His faculties appear intact. He's unable to speak and in extreme distress." Lestrade's eyes narrowed. "Then it's foul play." "It is," said Holmes. "And you may add to your list 2 men missing from this house, a valet named Harris and a footman named Larkin." Lestrade's mouth tightened. "That was reported, and no trace found." "No trace found," Holmes echoed mildly, "because you looked for footprints and overlooked carpentry." Lestrade frowned. "Carpentry?" Holmes moved toward the desk and indicated Miss Harrow with the slightest turn of his head. "This young lady has been of great assistance in bringing matters to a head." Miss Harrow's gaze snapped up. "Assistance?" she whispered, as if the word itself were poison. Lestrade stared at her. "Who is she?" "Miss Violet Harrow," said Holmes, "Sir Julian's secretary." Lestrade looked from her to Holmes. "And you think—" Holmes held up a hand, not to silence Lestrade, but to control the room. "I think," said he quietly, "that we are in danger of doing something irreparable out of haste." Darvell burst out, his voice hoarse with excitement. "Mr. Holmes, just now you said—" "I said what was necessary to stop a flight," Holmes cut in, without looking at him. Miss Harrow half rose. "A flight?" Holmes's eyes rested upon her for a long moment, and the whole air of him changed. The hard certainty, the prosecuting intensity, softened into something colder and more analytical. "You did not run," said he. "That is the point. A guilty person, with a hidden passage above her head and the police at the door, does not sit down and wait for handcuffs unless she believes herself safe, or unless she is not guilty." Miss Harrow's breath came out in a shuddering exhalation. For an instant she pressed a hand to her brow as if steadying herself against collapse. Lestrade blinked. "Then what the devil are we doing here? Is she under arrest or not?" "Not," said Holmes. "At least, not yet. There is a letter V upon that paper." He nodded to the desk where Sir Julian's jagged scrawl remained. "I suggested a name. It served to test a reaction and to fix everyone's attention. But the letter is incomplete, and the mind that wrote it was in terror." Lestrade's impatience flared. "Your games, Holmes." "My methods," Holmes corrected, "are the reason you are not still hunting for footprints in fog. Now listen, for we have minutes, not hours." He crossed to Sir Julian and spoke distinctly, as one speaks to a patient emerging from an aesthetic. "Sir Julian," said he, "you meant to write a word, not a name. If I speak the right one, you will squeeze Dr. Watson's hand." I took Sir Julian's cold, tense fingers in my own. Holmes began calmly, like a man ticking items from a list. "Violet?" Sir Julian's hand did not move. "Valet?" No movement. "Vault?" Sir Julian's fingers closed with sudden force upon mine, so fiercely that my knuckles whitened. Holmes nodded once, satisfied. "Vault," he repeated. "Thank you." Lestrade's brows drew together. "Vault? What vault?" Holmes turned briskly. "The coal vault beneath the pavement at the front of the house, or, more precisely, beneath the railings and area. It communicates with an old service cavity behind the paneling. The door with no handle is a concealed release, not a true entrance. The passage above leads down by a secondary drop and into the vault." Darvill's face had become ashen. Sir Julian never mentioned any vault. "Because he did not know it existed in that form," said Holmes. "Or because he chose not to know." Lestrade made a sharp gesture. "Constables, search the cellar." Holmes's hand shot out and caught his sleeve. "Not the cellar. That is the obvious place, and therefore the place a clever villain prepares. The vault is accessed from outside." Lestrade scowled, but he had learned, after enough humiliations, that Holmes's corrections were seldom gratuitous. "Come then," said he curtly. "Show me." Holmes did not move at once. His eyes had shifted to Darvill, and upon his face there was an expression I knew too well, the look of a man who has found the small, ugly pivot upon which a whole mechanism turns. "Before we go," said Holmes softly, "a question of housekeeping. Mr. Darvill, when you rang for the police, whom did you tell?" Darvill stared. "Whom? I sent George to the station." "No," Holmes interrupted. "You rang within the house. Who heard the bell? Who came? Who knew at once that the yard was on its way?" Darvill opened his mouth, then shut it. His eyes flicked involuntarily toward the corridor. Holmes's voice became very gentle indeed. "Peters," said he. "The footman who tends the fire at 7. The footman you named after a hesitation." Darvill swallowed. He has been restless all day." "And Dr. Penrose," Holmes continued, watching him. "Where is he now?" "At his surgery," Darvill muttered. "He left after examining Sir Julian." Holmes's gaze did not soften. "Did he leave by the front door?" "Yes." "Alone?" Darvill's throat worked. "I believe so." Holmes's eyes flashed to Miss Harrow. "When Dr. Penrose came this morning, who sent for him?" "I did," she said at once, seizing the lifeline. "From the telephone in the hall. I spoke to his assistant." Holmes nodded, and I saw him weigh it. "And when he left, did he speak to anyone in private?" Miss Harrow hesitated. He asked for Mr. Darvell. Darvell jerked. He asked about Sir Julian's family history. He said the shock might be connected to old anxieties. Holmes's mouth tightened. Medical curiosity can be a convenient mask. Lestrade's patience was at its end. For heaven's sake. Holmes, either you've got a suspect or you haven't. Holmes looked at him. I have a direction. The suspect will present himself if we do not blunder. He turned to the constables. One of you, stay with Sir Julian. No one enters or leaves this room. If anyone insists, you detain them. Is that clear? The constable nodded, a little startled at receiving orders from a civilian, but Lestrade's glance confirmed it. Holmes spoke next to Miss Harrow, and his tone, though still brisk, had a note of fairness. Miss Harrow, you will remain here. You are not accused at present, but you are involved, whether you intended it or not. If you have withheld anything about the governess, about Sir Percival's alterations, about letters, now is the time to decide whether you want the truth or the tragedy. Miss Harrow's lips parted. She looked from Sir Julian's tortured face to Holmes. There were letters, she said, almost inaudibly. From my aunt. She said she had been ruined here, that there was a room where she had been made to meet Sir Percival at night. That afterward, when she threatened to speak, he had the workmen seal it. She said the house swallowed her voice. Holmes's eyes narrowed. And your aunt is dead, she whispered. Long dead. But she left me those letters. I came to this position to see whether they were true. Not to hurt anyone. To know. Holmes nodded once as if a final piece had clicked into place. Knowledge, said he, is a dangerous inheritance. Lestrade cleared his throat, uncomfortable for perhaps the first time since entering. All very affecting, but if two men are missing, Holmes was already at the door. Then we are wasting time. We moved swiftly through the hall, out onto the damp steps. The fog clung thickly, muffling the sounds of the square. Holmes descended to the area railings and ran his fingers along the ironwork as if reading it like Braille. He stopped at a section where the stone at the base was darker. Here, said he. Lestrade held up his lantern. Beneath the railings, half hidden by shadow, was a low iron hatch set into the stone, flush, unremarkable, the sort of thing one might step over 100 times without noticing. Holmes crouched, and with the practiced ease of a man long accustomed to locks, produced his small key set. You said the obvious places are prepared, Lestrade muttered. What makes you so sure this is not prepared too? Holmes did not look up, because the preparation is the point. Whoever has used this hatch believes himself unobserved. He will not think to guard what he assumes no one sees. There was a soft click. Holmes lifted the hatch. A breath of air rose, stale, cold, and carrying with it a faint, unmistakable taint, the sour, sweet smell of confined human presence. Lestrade's face hardened. Down then. Holmes held the lantern lower, illuminating a narrow ladder descending into blackness, and from below, so faint that at first I thought it the groaning of old timbers, came a sound which turned my blood to ice, a weak, hoarse murmur, the thin remnant of a human voice struggling through darkness. Help. Holmes's eyes met mine for an instant, grim, satisfied, and urgent all at once. Alive, said he, as I told you. Then he swung his legs over the lip of the hatch and began to descend into the vault, his lantern bobbing like a will-o'-the-wisp swallowed by the fog. I followed Holmes down the ladder, the iron rungs cold and slick beneath my hands. The lantern light wavered as he descended, throwing grotesque shadows upon the stone shaft. The air grew heavier with each step, and that faint human sound, so fragile and yet so unmistakably alive, guided us like a thread through the dark. Lestrade came next, muttering something under his breath that sounded remarkably like a prayer, and the constables followed. When my boots at last touched solid ground, I found myself in a low, vaulted chamber of rough stone, scarcely higher than a tall man's reach. The lantern revealed an arched ceiling blackened with age, damp walls streaked with mineral stains and the detritus of long neglect. Broken crates, rusted tools, and heaps of coal reduced to crumbling dust, and there, huddled against the far wall, lay a man. He was scarcely more than a shape at first, limbs drawn in, head bowed, clothing torn and filthy. But when Holmes knelt beside him and raised the lantern, the light fell upon a face so gaunt and hollow-eyed that it startled me. Yet there was no mistaking him. "Harris," I breathed. The valet's eyes fluttered open at the sound of his name. His lips moved, but no words came. Holmes set the lantern down and supported the man's head with careful hands. "Easy," said he. "You're safe now. Can you hear me?" Harris nodded faintly. "How long has he been here?" Lestrade demanded, his voice echoing harshly in the confined space. Holmes did not answer at once. He had lifted Harris's wrist and was feeling for the pulse. "Days," he said finally. "Possibly weeks. He has been given water, sparingly. Enough to keep him alive, not enough to keep him strong." I knelt at once, my medical instincts overriding everything else. Harris was terribly weak, but conscious. His breathing, though shallow, was steady. "There may be another," I said. "Larkin." Holmes's eyes lifted sharply. "Search." The constables moved off, their lanterns probing the recesses of the vault. One of them gave a sudden exclamation. "Here, sir." Beyond a stack of rotting timber, they found the second man. Larkin lay stretched upon the stone, unconscious but breathing. His face bore the marks of prolonged confinement, sunken cheeks, cracked lips, the dull pallor of deprivation, but he was alive. Lestrade let out a long breath. "Alive," he repeated. "Both of them." Holmes rose slowly, his expression grim rather than triumphant. "Alive," said he, "which tells us something important." "What's that?" Lestrade asked. "That the intent was not murder," Holmes replied. "At least, not initially. They were removed, hidden, silenced, but kept alive. That requires purpose and discipline." "And mercy," Lestrade suggested. Holmes's mouth tightened. "No. Control." I had given Harris a sip from my flask, and some color returned faintly to his cheeks. He clutched weakly at my sleeve. "Mr. Holmes," he whispered hoarsely. "The doctor." Holmes was instantly beside him. "Yes, tell me." Harris swallowed with difficulty. "Dr. Penrose. He came at night, said Sir Julian wanted me. Took me up the east stairs, showed me the door, said it was a joke. Then—" His voice faltered, and he shuddered. There was a prick. "And darkness." Lestrade's jaw set. "Penrose." Holmes nodded. "As I suspected." Harris's eyes flickered toward the ladder. He said the house owed him silence, that some places must stay buried. Holmes straightened, his face cold and intent. "That will do," said he gently. "You have done enough." He turned to Lestrade. "You have your man. Dr. Penrose is not merely a physician, he is Sir Percival's grandson." Lestrade stared. "What?" "Sir Percival Deverell's only daughter married beneath her," Holmes continued. "The union was hushed. The child was sent away. Penrose is the result. He knew the house's secret history. He knew the passage because it was his inheritance, used once to conceal scandal, now repurposed to enforce silence." Lestrade's eyes flashed. "And Miss Harrow?" "A catalyst," said Holmes, "not a conspirator." Her inquiries stirred old fears. Sir Julian, pressed by her questions and by the vanished servants, began to dig. Penrose acted to stop him, temporarily. "By drugging him," Lestrade growled. "By silencing him," Holmes corrected. The drug affects the vocal nerves. It induces terror and incapacity without lasting harm, if administered carefully." "And if not?" Lestrade asked grimly. Holmes's silence was answer enough. We did not linger. The constables were instructed to bring the two men up carefully, and I remained to oversee their movement, my heart lifting with the knowledge that we were not too late. Holmes and Lestrade ascended ahead of us. By the time I emerged into the foggy night once more, the square was alive with quiet activity. A second cab had arrived, the iron hatch stood open, guarded now by a constable whose lantern cast a steady glow. Holmes stood apart, his hands clasped behind him, gazing at the house as one might regard an adversary, finally understood. Lestrade approached him. "Penrose won't be hard to find. He has a surgery on Wimpole Street. We'll take him within the hour." Holmes inclined his head. "See that you do, and see that he is not left alone with his thoughts." Lestrade hesitated. "You were right, Holmes, about the preparation, about the vault, about nearly everything." Holmes smiled faintly. "Nearly is sufficient." We returned to the study not long after. Sir Julian lay upon the sofa now, propped with cushions. His eyes brightened when he saw us, and when he saw, supported between constables, the two gaunt but living figures. Tears sprang unbidden to his eyes. He made a sound, not the strangled noise of before, but something closer to relief. "The drug will wear off," Holmes told him quietly. "Your voice will return, but the truth has already spoken." Miss Harrow stood near the window. She turned as we entered, her expression a mingling of sorrow and resolve. "I will give you the letters," she said to Holmes. "All of them. Sir Julian must read them." Holmes nodded. "He should. A house cannot be cured of its ghosts by pretending they were never there." Sir Julian reached out a trembling hand toward her. She hesitated only a moment before taking it. As the constables led Harris and Larkin away to warmth and care, and as Lestrade departed to complete his grim errand, I found myself once more alone with Holmes by the fire. "You saw it early," I said quietly. "The use of the passage. The intention." Holmes shook his head. "Not early, only in time." He glanced toward the study door, the solid, respectable door which concealed no secret and pretended to none. "The most dangerous mechanisms," said he thoughtfully, "are those built not of steel or springs, but of shame. Once set in motion, they outlive their makers." Outside, the fog was thinning. A faint, pale light was beginning to creep into the square, the first sign of morning. Holmes turned away from the house at last, already withdrawing into that distant, reflective mood which follows his greatest exertions. "Come, Watson," said he. "There will be statements and doctors and explanations enough to weary any man. Our work here is done." Yet as we stepped out into the damp London air, I could not help but glance back once more at the tall, silent facade of the Deverell House, and at the iron hatch, now closed and guarded. For I knew that, though the door with no handle had been opened at last, the past it concealed would not be so easily shut away again. The events which followed moved, as such things always do, with a curious mixture of swiftness and delay. Swift in that Dr. Penrose was apprehended before noon that very day in his consulting rooms in Wimpole Street, where he submitted to arrest with a composure so complete that it was, in itself, a final confirmation of his guilt. Delayed in that the truth, once exposed, required time to settle upon the minds of those whose lives it had quietly shaped for years. I saw Sir Julian again 2 days later. His voice, though still weak, had returned sufficiently for speech, and he insisted that Holmes and I should attend him in his study, which had already begun to look less like the scene of a tragedy and more like the orderly retreat of a man reclaiming command over his affairs. He lay upon a chaise by the fire, wrapped in a dressing gown, his features still drawn but no longer contorted by terror. When Holmes entered, Sir Julian fixed him with a long, steady look and then spoke, slowly, deliberately, as if he wished each word to carry its full weight. "You gave me back more than my voice, Mr. Holmes," said he. "You gave me the courage to look where I have refused to look for 40 years. Holmes inclined his head. "The courage was always yours, Sir Julian. It merely required a prod." Sir Julian's mouth twisted faintly. "And a blowpipe, it seems." Holmes allowed himself the ghost of a smile. Inspector Lestrade arrived shortly thereafter, bringing with him the official outline of events, now stripped of their mystery and reduced to the plain language of law. Penrose, confronted with the testimony of Harris and Larkin, the darts, the passage, and, most damning of all, the letters Miss Harrow produced without hesitation, had abandoned pretense. His confession, delivered with clinical detachment, was as chilling as it was complete. He had grown up, it appeared, on fragments and silences. A grandmother's bitterness, a mother's shame, a legacy defined not by inheritance but by omission. The sealed room had become, in his mind, not merely a relic of family disgrace, but a symbol of injustice, one which demanded guardianship. When Miss Harrow's presence threatened to draw light upon it, and when Sir Julian's growing unease suggested that the past might finally be examined, Penrose acted, not in sudden passion, but with careful preparation. He had removed the servants who came closest to discovering the truth. He had silenced Sir Julian when inquiry turned to action, and he would, in time, have done more, had not Holmes intervened. The house, Lestrade remarked afterward, was both his weapon and his accomplice. Holmes corrected him gently. "No, Inspector, the house was only a tool. It was the secrecy that armed him." Miss Harrow bore the revelations with quiet dignity. When Sir Julian read the letters at last, his face tightening with each line, she did not watch him, but stared instead at the fire, as though the flames held answers no man could give her. "I did not come to punish," she said once, when Sir Julian had finished and sat with bowed head, "only to know whether my aunt had spoken truth or whether grief had twisted her memory." Sir Julian looked at her then, not as a master at a servant, nor as an old man at a young woman, but as one human soul at another. "She spoke truth," said he, "and I, by my silence, made myself her accomplice." What passed between them afterward is not for me to set down in detail. It is enough to say that Miss Harrow left Montague Square with her questions answered, and that Sir Julian, for all the damage done, took the first genuine steps toward reparation which his position allowed. The house, I am told, will undergo alterations, not to conceal, but to reveal. The white-painted door at the end of the east passage has already been removed. As for Harris and Larkin, their recovery was slow, but sure. Weakness of the body is, mercifully, more easily mended than weakness of the spirit, and both men, sustained by care and compensation, resumed their lives with a gratitude that needed no words. It was a week later, on a morning unusually clear for London, that Holmes and I found ourselves once more in Baker Street. He lay upon the sofa, his eyes half closed, his violin idle at his side. The case, so consuming only days before, appeared already to have receded into that vast mental archive from which he drew his strange satisfaction. "You were severe with Miss Harrow," I observed, breaking a silence which had grown companionable. Holmes opened one eye. "I was precise. You accused her openly." "I tested her," said he, "and she did not break. Guilt seeks escape. Innocence seeks explanation." And Penrose. Holmes's gaze drifted to the ceiling. A man who mistakes guardianship for ownership. He believed himself the keeper of a secret, when in truth he was its prisoner. I considered this. Then the door with no handle was never meant to be opened at all. Holmes's lips curved slightly. On the contrary, it was opened the moment it was built, opened upon a lie. Everything afterward was merely the consequence. He reached at last for his violin and drew the bow lightly across the strings. The sound that emerged was low and reflective, not the brilliant, driving music with which he sometimes celebrated success, but something quieter and more inward. Architects, he went on, as if the thought amused him, are rarely held accountable for the moral implications of their work. Yet a poorly placed wall may warp more lives than a poorly written law. You make it sound, said I, smiling, as though you blame the building. I blame the impulse, Holmes replied. Men who hide their crimes behind stone and timber forget that structures endure longer than reputations. Eventually, the walls speak. I rose to go, for my duties called me elsewhere, and Holmes showed no inclination to detain me. As I took my hat, he spoke again, his tone deceptively casual. Watson, if ever you are tempted to seal away a difficult truth, remember Montague Square. I shall, said I, though I hope never again to encounter a door which opens upon a wall. Holmes's eyes glinted with that familiar, ironic humor. Oh, you will, said he. We all do. The difference lies in whether we dare to push. I descended the steps into Baker Street with his words echoing in my mind. The city moved about its business, unaware, as it always is, of how narrowly it had skirted a darker outcome. And as the fog lifted and the sun struck faintly upon the windows, I reflected that the most unsettling mysteries are not those which defy reason, but those which reveal how much human suffering may be concealed behind something as simple and as silent as a door with no handle.